They were called the families. They lived by a code older than the country itself, and for nearly a century, they ran America from the shadows. Every week, we open the files on the men who built the underworld, the bosses, the wars, the rituals, the betrayals, the blood oaths that bound them, and the secrets they swore to take to the grave. Subscribe. Some stories were never meant to be told.
The Heist at the Bamboo Lounge. Step into the Bamboo Lounge on Rockaway Parkway, a classy joint just a stone's throw from the airport, where the mob's stolen goods float as freely as the liquor. This was the golden era when Henry Hill and his crew were turning violent hijackings into a booming, open-air retail business. The staggering volume of stolen merchandise, from razor blades to furs, was fenced right out in the open, with mobsters like Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke conducting their illicit commerce without a shred of fear. But the crew's ambitions were about to escalate from peddling hot cargo to orchestrating a legendary cash heist. The target was Air France, and the inside man was a charismatic airport worker named Frenchy. Frenchy was a jovial, funny family man from Hempstead who frequently funneled lucrative tips to the mob, having recently netted them a box of silk dresses that easily sold for $18,000. One fateful day, Frenchy handed Henry the ultimate tip. Massive amounts of untraceable American currency were temporarily being stored in a highly vulnerable cargo office while a new, secure cement block strong room was being constructed. This money, returning from overseas tourists and soldiers converting cash, was neatly packed in large white canvas bags stamped with bright red seals. Henry's eyes widened at the prospect, and he immediately rushed to Jimmy Burke's bar, Robert's Lounge, to share the explosive news. That very weekend, Henry, Jimmy, Tommy DeSimone, and another associate named Raymond Montemurro descended on the airport to execute the robbery. They rented cars and slapped on stolen license plates, ready for a massive payday. But the caper hit an immediate brick wall. The cargo area was swarming with 2 or 3 dozen workers, making an armed stick-up absolutely impossible. Frustrated but mesmerized by the sight of those canvas bags stacked against the wall, the crew knew they had to find a stealthier way in. They desperately needed the key to the room, and Frenchy revealed that a completely oblivious, $100-a-week security guard held it. Armed with the guard's address, Henry and Montemurro staked out his depressing furnished room located across from a White Castle on Rockaway Boulevard. When the guard left for his day off, they burglarized the apartment, ripping through every drawer in a frantic search for the key. Unbelievably, the guard had taken the key with him. The setback infuriated Jimmy Burke, whose legendary violent temper began to boil over. Jimmy chillingly suggested that the next time Frenchy gave the word, they should simply abduct the guard, take the key, and, knowing Jimmy's brutal methods, likely murder the poor man. Henry knew he had to act fast to prevent a senseless bloodbath. Henry noticed a stack of detective and girly magazines scattered around the guard's apartment, sparking a brilliant psychological trap. He instructed Frenchy to take the unsuspecting guard out for drinks at the nearby Jade East Motel, where Frenchy began spinning wild tales about a beautiful, nymphomaniac friend who loved to party. The bait was set, and the lonely guard eagerly swallowed it. The crew reached out to a high-class, $150 a night Bronx prostitute who catered to elite Wall Street bookmakers. Strikingly beautiful and resembling the actress Natalie Wood, she didn't look like a typical streetwalker, making the illusion absolutely perfect. The execution of the sting was pure underworld theater. Frenchy brought the guard back to the Jade East Motel to meet his stunning friend, who immediately threw herself at the mesmerized target. Feigning work obligations, Frenchy left the two alone, allowing the hooker to take the guard upstairs to bed. Having proven the guard's extreme vulnerability, the crew organized a final dry run the following weekend. The motel featured private basement steam rooms and whirlpools, creating the perfect isolation chamber. Frenchy and the girl lured the guard down to the steam room for an hour and a half, leaving the room key hidden under a hallway ashtray. The signal that the coast was clear was Frenchy parting the room's blinds. This gave Henry and Tommy DeSimone the exact window of opportunity they desperately needed to slip in, grab the Air France key, and have a duplicate made before the guard even realized it was gone. With the cloned key securely in their possession, Frenchy delivered the golden news later that night. A massive shipment of cash, estimated between $400,000 and $700,000, was scheduled to arrive on Friday. The trap was flawlessly laid, and the crew prepared to walk away with an absolute fortune, the aftermath of a major heist in the underworld. The aftermath of a major heist in the underworld isn't just about counting the cash, it's a highly dangerous game of appeasing the bosses, laundering the loot, and investing in the next illicit enterprise. When Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and Tommy DeSimone walked away with a fortune, their very first order of business was paying the necessary insurance to keep everyone happy. That meant taking care of Buster and handing a hefty cut to Lucchese capo Paul Vario, simply out of respect for his position as their boss. Once the hierarchy was satisfied and their protective umbrella was secured, the crew pooled the remaining cash, hiding it safely away in the vaults of trusted bookmakers. But for young, adrenaline-fueled wise guys, letting cash gather dust in a safe was an impossible task. They were itching to spend some money on themselves, but they needed a cover story to avoid suspicion. To justify their sudden windfall, Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy orchestrated a quick trip to Las Vegas, where they deliberately dropped about 20 grand at the tables. They returned to New York loudly bragging to anyone who would listen that they had hit a massive winning streak. With their newly acquired wealth freshly laundered through this Vegas alibi, the spending spree began in earnest. Henry threw down a down payment for a stunning 1967 gold Buick Riviera with a sleek black top, while Tommy matched his extravagance by picking up a brand new beige Cadillac. In the Mafia, however, idle cash is wasted cash. Barely 2 weeks after their massive score, Paul Vario approached Henry and Jimmy at the Aqueduct racetrack with a highly lucrative proposition, buying a 50% stake in Milty Weckar's sprawling bookmaking operation. Weckar was a seasoned bookie who had recently been burned betting heavily on his own action and desperately needed an infusion of mob capital. For Henry and Jimmy, it was an absolute goldmine. Weckar's client list was a veritable who's who of high-rolling degenerates, including wealthy garment center executives, Wall Street brokers, doctors, dentists, and lawyers. Weckar was a master of the trade, constantly analyzing the betting sheets and adjusting the odds on the fly to manipulate the action, while laying off heavy bets to connections in Florida, St. Louis, Vegas, and California when the financial exposure got too high. Operating this underground casino required absolute, chilling precision. Tuesday was universally known as Straighten Up Day, the day when every bookmaker and highline bettor in the city had to settle their accounts. Henry and the crew would gather at a garment center restaurant called Bobby's to tally the payout sheets. The ledgers accounted for everything, including a mandatory $700 a week in ice paid directly to corrupt police commanders at the Borough Command and the Division to keep the operation running smoothly. If the crew suffered a bad week, Paul Vario would effortlessly float them $25,000 or $30,000 in cash, completely interest-free. But Milty Weckar also had a brilliant, psychological trick up his sleeve to stall victorious bettors. He kept a stash of 5 or 6 pristine $1,000 bills. Knowing that mob-connected gamblers were terrified of trying to cash such high-denomination bills, Henry would deliberately flash the $1,000 notes to the winners. It worked like a charm every time, buying the syndicate a few extra days to come up with smaller, more manageable bills. The cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement was a constant, exhausting hustle. Weckar operated out of 5 different wire rooms across the city, moving locations up to twice a week to outrun police surveillance. To facilitate this endless migration, they kept an elderly man on a $300 a week payroll whose sole existence consisted of riding the Long Island Railroad and city subways to rent new apartments, put down deposits, and set up fresh telephone and utility lines under fake names. Even when the police commissioner's confidential investigating unit occasionally managed to raid a room, the consequences were laughable: a minor misdemeanor charge and a slap on the wrist $50 fine. Nobody ever went to real prison for booking bets. And when degenerate gamblers tried to welsh on their debts, Henry simply strong-armed them into paying. Victims knew they had nowhere to turn when facing the muscle of Paul Vario's crew. Yet, the relentless pressure of the streets began to weigh heavily on Henry's wife, Karen. With 2 young daughters at home, she demanded that Henry find a legitimate business to anchor their lives, correctly viewing the life of a gambling bookmaker as a one-way ticket to the loan sharks. Yielding to her demands, Henry sought Paul Vario's blessing to take over a sprawling nightclub on Queens Boulevard called The Suite. Surprisingly, Paulie loved the idea of a clean, legitimate front and strictly ordered the rest of his dangerous crew to stay away from the joint so it wouldn't attract police heat. For a brief, shining moment, Henry ran The Suite like a legitimate businessman. He was there from morning until night, with Karen keeping the dual sets of books, one for the IRS and the State Liquor Authority, and the real ones for themselves. Henry even enlisted union boss Casey Rosato to send in undercover spies to monitor the bar. When the spies reported that the bartenders were skimming $1,000 a night on top of their salaries and tips, Henry ruthlessly fired the entire staff. But in the underworld, Keeping a venue clean is an impossible dream. Slowly, the predators began to circle back to the suite. Jimmy Burke arrived first, bringing his wife and a good luck plant. Then Tommy DeSimone dropped in for a celebratory toast. Soon, the city's most lethal racketeers, Angelo Seep, Marty Krugman, Little Vic Arena, and eventually Paul Vario and his brothers, were all making the suite their obligatory last stop of the night. Arriving after midnight, they treated the club as their own private sanctuary, eating and drinking entirely on Henry's tab. Within 6 months, Henry Hill's dream of a legitimate business had completely evaporated, transformed into just another mob hangout where his closest underworld associates were drinking his hard-earned profits completely dry. Behind the scenes, the domestic reality of a rising wise guy was just as bizarre. Most mob wives insisted on doing their own housework because outsiders simply couldn't be trusted to keep their mouths shut, but Karen was relentless in demanding a maid. Henry eventually turned to Eddie Rigaud, a Haitian associate who bought stolen cars from the crew, who offered a chilling solution. Rigaud claimed his family in the mountains could purchase a young girl from her parents for a mere $600, ship her to Canada on a tourist visa, and deliver her as a virtual slave to the Hill household. It was yet another stark reminder that in Henry Hill's world, absolutely everything, and everyone, had a price. Henry Hill's story. It always struck Henry Hill as a bitter, almost laughable irony that after a lifetime of orchestrating major heists and pulling off massive underworld scores, his longest stretch behind bars, a staggering 10-year federal sentence, came courtesy of a petty barroom brawl. Folks, you couldn't write a more twisted stroke of bad luck. It started as a spur-of-the-moment vacation. Henry hopped a flight to Tampa, Florida, with the legendary Jimmy Burke and Casey Rosado, a local union boss from Kennedy Airport. The mission was simple. Rosado wanted some muscle to help collect a gambling debt from a man named John Ciaccio. When they arrived at Ciaccio's sprawling cement block lounge, Casey's cousin handed Henry an antique .38 revolver, a weapon so old Henry figured it would explode if he actually pulled the trigger. The trio walked into the dark, crowded bar, and within minutes, Rosado and Ciaccio were screaming at each other in Spanish. In Henry's world, negotiations are swift and brutal. Jimmy Burke grabbed Ciaccio by the tie, twisting it until the man's eyes bulged, and drove his fist right into Ciaccio's throat. With Henry brandishing the .38, they marched the terrified man out of the lounge. Out of 25 patrons sitting in that bar, not a single person moved a muscle to stop them. In the getaway car, Ciaccio tried to play the tough guy, screaming that they'd have to kill him before he paid, so Henry casually pistol-whipped him across the face until the man suddenly remembered his manners and agreed to settle the debt. The crew dragged the bleeding man into the storage room of another bar, extracted the money, and spent the rest of the weekend peacefully sipping rum and brandy. Case closed, right? Wrong. The feds swooped in and turned this routine shakedown into a massive syndicate case. The reason why is pure, unbelievable irony. John Ciaccio's sister just happened to be a typist for the FBI in Tampa. Terrified for her family's safety, she broke down crying in the middle of the federal office, spilling everything she knew to a swarm of agents. She handed the authorities Henry, Jimmy, and the whole crew on a silver platter. Sentenced to 10 years, Henry was shipped off to a federal penitentiary, but if you think he was heading into a living hell, you don't know how the Mafia operates. For a wise guy, prison was just another mobbed-up neighborhood. When Henry walked into the facility, the guards acted like ghosts. He was greeted by a reception committee of Cosa Nostra royalty, his boss Paul Vario, union racketeer Johnny Dio, and Fat Hand D. With a simple $50 bribe, Henry bypassed the general population and was placed in an honor dorm that looked more like a holiday inn than a federal lockup. Wise guys didn't do real time, they isolated themselves from the rest of the inmates, paid off the toughest lifers to keep the peace, and essentially owned the joint. The luxury behind bars was absolutely staggering. Henry, Polly, and the rest of the crew had comfortable beds, private baths, and a kitchen set up strictly against the rules. They smuggled in hot plate elements, which Paul Vario expertly fashioned into makeshift stoves, and cooked elaborate feasts. We're talking steaks, veal cutlets, shrimp, and red snapper, all smuggled inside by corrupt hacks who were on the crew's payroll. Scotch was flowing at $30 a pint, stored discreetly in aftershave jars. When Henry's wife, Karen, visited on weekends, she smuggled in even more food and wine, turning the prison visiting room into a private banquet where they drank booze out of coffee cups. But Henry wasn't just lounging around, he was a relentless hustler who used his time inside to expand his empire. First, he finessed the government out of $600 a month in veterans' educational benefits, using the GI Bill to take college courses. He learned to read properly, devoured books, and even built and maintained red clay tennis courts in the prison yard, sparking a massive tennis craze among the city's most lethal hitmen and racketeers. More importantly, Henry set up a highly lucrative bookmaking operation right under the warden's nose. Within 3 months, he was taking sports bets from inmates and prison guards alike. One of his best customers was the disgraced former mayor of Newark, Hugh Adonizzo, a degenerate gambler who would bet 20 packs of cigarettes a game on college and pro football every single weekend. To keep the massive amounts of illicit cash from being confiscated by the guards, Henry ran a brilliant outside operation. He had Karen handle all the actual payouts and collections on the streets. Because everyone knew she represented Henry and the Lucchese family, nobody dared cheat her. Even behind the towering stone walls of a federal penitentiary, the mob's relentless money-making machine never stopped humming. The rise and fall of Henry Hill. Step behind the razor wire of the Lewisburg Penitentiary and into the fractured domestic life of a rising mobster. While Henry Hill was locked away, his wife Karen was left to fend for herself, forced to clip poodles at night just to keep her family fed. The supposed brotherhood of the Mafia was exposed as an absolute sham. Karen quickly realized that when a wise guy goes away, all his debts and bets are instantly off the table. Henry's so-called friends pleaded poverty and drove around in brand-new cars, proving that no one in the underworld would willingly hand over cash to the wife of a man behind bars. But Henry Hill was never one to sit idle. Realizing that survival inside cost nearly $500 a week in bribes and special privileges, he turned his prison sentence into a lucrative illicit enterprise. He started by making up to $1,500 a month selling booze and marijuana that Karen smuggled inside. Once he landed a prime job on the prison farm, Henry's operation exploded. He reached out to Paul Vario in Pittsburgh to ship him a staggering 100 pounds of marijuana. Soon, Henry was running a full-blown pharmacy behind bars, wholesaling uppers, quaaludes, cocaine, and heroin. He built a dedicated drug crew that included Bobby Germain, a stick-up artist on the lam pretending to be a freelance writer, and a courier named Judy Wicks who refused to make a delivery without her lucky pink and blue hat. Henry's hustle was so successful he even began dealing automatic rifles and pistols smuggled out of a Connecticut armory, pulling in enough cash to casually buy his daughter a $200 imported porcelain doll from Schwartz. The hustle never stopped. Henry's crew even orchestrated a massive point-shaving scheme involving Boston College basketball players. Working with players like Rich Kuhn and a player named Sweeney, the mobsters manipulated the point spreads. But the operation nearly turned deadly during a Providence game when Sweeney ignored the 7-point spread and played to win. Henry chillingly noted that if they had bet big money on that game, the players would have been dead. Everything changed, however, just 2 months after Henry was finally released from prison. He received a tip from his bookmaker pal, Marty Krugman, that would set the stage for the most infamous cash robbery in American history. The target was the Lufthansa German Airlines cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. According to Krugman's inside man, Lee Werner, millions of dollars in untraceable $50 and $100 bills were sitting unguarded in a cardboard vault. It was the ultimate criminal fantasy, clean, unmarked cash that required no fences and no middlemen. Henry became obsessed with the Lufthansa score, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. His mentor, the terrifying Jimmy Burke, was being released to a Manhattan halfway house, along with their trigger-happy associate, Tommy D. Simone. Jimmy immediately took charge, assembling a lethal crew that included Tommy and Joe Buddha as gunmen, Angelo Seep and Anthony Rodriguez as inside men, Fat Louis Cafora, and Paolo Lee Castri, an illegal Sicilian shooter. To ensure a clean getaway, Stax Edwards, a black associate, was tasked with disposing of the panel trucks. To guarantee the mob's political machine kept the heat off, Jimmy arranged tribute payments, a massive cut for his Lucchese capo Paul Vario, and a share for Vinny Asaro, the Bonanno family's airport crew chief. The trap was sprung on Monday, December 11, 1978, at exactly 3:12 in the morning. A black Ford Econoline van backed into a garage bay near the vault. When Lufthansa security guard Kerry Whalen approached to investigate, a man in a knitted black cap stepped out of the shadows and violently pistol-whipped him across the forehead with a .45 automatic. The crew vanished into the night with a staggering fortune. And where was Henry Hill while his crew was pulling off the heist of the century? He had secured the perfect alibi. Completely unaware of the exact timing of the strike, Henry spent the night getting incredibly drunk with Marty Krugman at the Spice of Life bar in Cedarhurst. After a bitter argument with his wife Karen, he crashed at a girlfriend's apartment on East 89th Street. The next morning, Henry awoke to news flashes interrupting television and radio broadcasts, WINS radio promised live coverage of the massive heist. Jimmy Burke quickly called Henry, ordering him to meet at the Stage Delicatessen in Manhattan. When Henry arrived, he found Jimmy and Tommy DeSimone feeling celebratory, carrying envelopes stuffed with thousands in cash before heading back to check into their halfway house. The crew was flush with illicit wealth. Fat Louis Cafora was so ecstatic he bought his wife a white Cadillac as a surprise wedding present. But the rivers of stolen cash would soon unleash an unprecedented wave of paranoia, betrayal, and bloodshed across the New York underworld.